Sinn Féin for bringing forward this motion this evening. When it comes to housing as a public good, we in the Labour Party believe in three pillars for a housing system that works for all. The first is social and truly affordable housing. The second is security of tenure for renters. And the third is a truly ambitious home building programme. For us, the marker of the government's Housing for All policy is success or failure, is whether it strives to achieve those three aims, and, of course, whether it succeeds in achieving them. The government has failed these tests. We are joined in that view by the Housing Commission, by frontline organisations. We've heard from the Simon community today too. We are also joined in that view by all those at the coalface of the housing crisis. Families in emergency accommodation, adults spending their 20s, 30s and indeed 40s living in their parents' house because they cannot afford to either rent or buy. People who are languishing for years on the housing list. I could go on. When we talk about the housing crisis, we are referring to a fundamental systemic failure. We need a radical reset in government policy on housing. We acknowledge schemes which have provided much needed support for those looking to own their own homes, and I want to be fair and acknowledge where progress has been made. It would not be fair to fail to acknowledge that progress. However, the reality remains that large swathes of the population are still locked out of decent and affordable homes. We all meet on a daily basis those who are in this situation, and I have been doing now the advice clinics in the constituency we share now for 10 years as a councillor and TD. And the majority of cases that have come to me always have been housing. But in the last 3 years, the majority of those housing cases are many young people who have a deposit maybe saved, but still feel a million miles away from owning a home and are thinking, should they take the €20,000, 15,000, 20,000 euro that they've scraped so hard to save for a number of years, and should they invest that abroad and start a new life? And that is the reality of the housing situation. In some cases, as we know, we've up to 3 generations living under one roof, crammed into unsuitable homes because they cannot afford to move out. Kids trying to raise their kids in front of their parents, not an easy task and not something that makes for a comfortable living situation, no matter how well you may get on with your family. Crucially, we are still waiting for the government's home building targets to be revised upwards. And maybe this will be a general election announcement or ploy, but we know that these targets have been low for a number of years. Ivana Bacik received concession from the former Taoiseach nearly a year ago that building targets needed to go up. The same concession was echoed then by the former Minister for Finance and indeed the incoming Taoiseach. And we were glad to see that acknowledgement when it came, because when we first called for an ambition of at least 50,000 new builds and 50,000 retrofitted homes every year, the reaction of the government TDs was laughter and derision. And now, knowing the reality that we face, that this is the scale of the issue. The lack of access to secure and affordable homes has been and remains the #1 issue for many years, and it impacts the multitude of crises in other areas. The teaching positions that are vacant because teachers can't afford to live in Dublin or indeed our major cities. The vacancies in our healthcare sector because our healthcare workers cannot afford to live or cannot find accommodation near where they work. In spring, a Eurobarometer report showed that 61% of people in Ireland think housing is one of the top 2 issues facing the country, compared with an EU average of 10%. And the need for housing, the crisis in housing, hasn't been met with the ambition or the urgency required to actually solve the issue. We know that not enough homes are being built, but even the low-hanging fruit isn't being grasped. Compulsory purchase by local authorities to tackle vacancy is far too slow. The Labour Party submitted amendments to the planning bill to try to constructively address this issue. Those amendments were ignored. We support the LDA being more fully capitalised, but we can and we should be more ambitious for it. We want it to be transformed into a state construction company that can provide decent homes at scale, as well as decent, reliable jobs in the construction industry. We're 3 years into Housing for All, and notwithstanding the Minister's perpetual optimism, it's failing on too many of the crucial metrics. We saw last week the CSO report that house prices have soared by over 10% in the last year. They're now more than 13% more expensive than their peak before the crash. Rents have shot up 27% since Housing for All was launched. Meanwhile, wages have only increased by 10% in the same period. Most damningly, though, homelessness has gone up by 70% since September 2021, when the policy was launched. Nearly 4,500 children now living in emergency accommodation. We know that the vast majority of people accessing emergency accommodation come from the private rental sector, and evictions continue to rise. Almost 20,000 notice to quits were served in the last year. I don't know how anyone can conclude anything other than a total policy failure when taking these metrics into account. On affordable housing, the figures released last week show that there is the hope the government will reach its already inadequate targets this year. There's 499 affordable purchase homes, 966 cost rentals delivered in 2023. And in the first half of this year, there's only been 166 affordable homes delivered and 392 cost rentals. This is beyond unacceptable. Leaving aside the issue of delivery for a moment, there also appears to be a deep misunderstanding in government of the word affordable. Take, for example, a 3-bed apartment in City West. Cost rental applicants would still be paying €1,750 a month for that apartment. I don't see how that can be considered affordable for people on average income. Cost renters can't pay more than 35% of their net income on rent, meaning a minimum net household income of €60,000 would be required for that apartment. Two issues arise from this. Firstly, the cost of building remains far too high. And second, cost rental calculations are based on dysfunctional market prices rather than actual, genuine affordability. We need a radical reset in housing policy to bring down construction costs, bring down prices for buyers and renters, and to create a system of genuinely affordable housing. I will again appeal to government, or rather the next government, to implement Labour's acquisition of development land bill, to implement the Kenny report and bring down the cost of land and take a major step towards stabilising housing prices. Thank you.